In a small town called Wattle Creek, nestled in the golden plains of the New South Wales Riverina, life flowed as slow and steady as the irrigation channel that fed the surrounding paddocks. Every morning was a chorus of galahs screeching from the peppercorn trees and the distant rumble of a tractor starting its day. Mums hung washing on hills hoists, while kids rode their bikes down dusty gravel lanes. It was a simple, unpretentious place, where everyone knew your name, your business, and what you'd had for tea last night. A town built on handshakes, shared beers at the pub, and a quiet understanding that you helped a neighbor in need. No one could have possibly imagined that on the scorching afternoon of May 12, 2023, that profound quiet would be shattered by a scream that would curdle the very soul of the town. The sun had been relentless all day, bleaching the sky to a pale, washed-out blue. But as the afternoon wore on, the heat began to soften, and a faint breeze stirred, carrying the scent of dry grass and sun-baked earth from the recently harvested wheat fields. Sarah Jenkins, a young mother who spent her days on her feet at the local fruit-packing shed, was finally walking home. The gravel crunched under her worn work boots. Usually, as she made her way down the town's main street, she'd offer a tired but friendly wave to neighbors sitting on the wide verandas of their weatherboard homes. She was known as a quiet woman, not one for gossip, but she carried an aura of gentle warmth. Sarah walked with a hurried pace, her thoughts already at home with the two little boys who were her entire world, Leo, her 8-year-old, a boisterous soul who lived and breathed footy, and 5-year-old Finn, the dreamer, who was always sketching on scraps of paper. Just a few days ago, Finn had drawn a picture of their family, stick figures with wide smiles, standing under the sprawling jacaranda tree in their front yard. Sarah had stuck it to the fridge with a magnet, a little beacon of joy she'd look at every morning before leaving for her long shift. But that afternoon, her journey home came to an abrupt, sickening halt. As she cut across the well-worn track alongside the irrigation channel that ran behind her house, her eyes caught something snagged on a cluster of reeds in the murky, slow-moving water. At first, she dismissed it as just another plastic shopping bag, carelessly tossed and carried by the current. But then, as a sliver of the late afternoon sun broke through the gum trees and glinted off the object, her heart stopped. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized her. Her hands flew to her mouth, trembling uncontrollably. Her lips quivered, forming the names of her children in a silent, desperate plea. Then came the scream. It was a raw, primal sound of pure terror that ripped through the afternoon stillness, sending a flock of cockatoos screeching from the power lines. Neighbors, hearing the ungodly sound, came running. Women left pots simmering on stoves, and men who'd been sharing a beer on their porches abandoned their drinks and bolted towards the sound. They thought maybe it was a brown snake, or perhaps a dog had fallen in. But as they drew closer and saw what Sarah was staring at, their faces turned ashen. Floating in the shallow, green-brown water were the small, still bodies of Leo and Finn. Sarah screamed again, a sound of utter devastation, before her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the dry, cracked earth, unconscious. The neighbors' shock gave way to a wave of communal grief. A few of the men, without a word, waded into the water and gently lifted the two small boys, carrying them to the bank. They laid them down on a tarp someone had grabbed from the back of a ute. Jack Murray, the town's publican and unofficial elder, whose hair was as white as river sand, wiped his weathered face with a shaky hand. He muttered under his breath that in all his 70 years in Wattle Creek, he'd never seen a tragedy so cruel. Liam Jenkins, Sarah's husband, was out on a remote property, finishing a long day of shearing. A neighbor, knowing where he was working, had jumped in his ute and sped down the back roads to find him. When he got the news, Liam's world tilted on its axis. Leaving his gear scattered in the dust, he drove back to town with a panic so intense he could barely breathe. When he arrived home, he saw the crowd, the flashing lights that had just pulled up, and in the middle of it all, the two small shapes covered by a thin blanket. He fell to his knees, pulling back the cover and gathering his sons into his arms, his body racked with a deep, guttural sobbing that seemed to tear the air apart. The sound was so full of a father's broken heart that even the most stoic old farmers couldn't stop the tears from rolling down their own sun-creased cheeks. Soon after, the local police arrived, followed by paramedics. They immediately cordoned off the area with bright yellow tape, a stark, ugly gash in the peaceful landscape. The crowd of neighbors was gently but firmly asked to move back. The sky was now a brilliant orange and purple, but the sunset held no beauty, it was just a mournful backdrop to the horror. Yellow plastic markers, fluttering in the breeze, designated the spot as a serious crime scene, though no one dared use that word yet. The officers worked with a grim efficiency, taking photographs, making notes, and examining the boys' bodies. But there was something deeply unsettling. There were no visible marks, no scratches or bruises. Their clothes were still neat, showing no signs of a struggle. Whispers began to ripple through the stunned crowd. The channel wasn't deep, at its highest, the water barely reached a man's waist. It seemed impossible for two boys, one of them a strong 8-year-old, to have drowned so quietly, without a single cry for help. On the veranda of the small weatherboard house, Mavis Jenkins, Liam and Finn's grandmother, was wailing, her body shaking with violent sobs, as she clutched her chest. She cried out that she'd only stepped out to the backyard veggie patch for a moment, just to pick some beans for dinner. When she came back inside, her grandsons were gone. She'd assumed they'd just run off to a friend's place down the road, never imagining, not for a second, that she'd find them like this. The townspeople, who heard her, felt a fresh wave of pity. Everyone knew Mavis doted on her grandsons. She was always the one taking them lamingtons from the CWA bake sale, or rocking them to sleep with old country lullabies. But behind the gut-wrenching grief, a terrible question hung in the heavy air. How could two boys die together, in broad daylight, without a single person hearing a thing? Was this truly a freak accident, or was it something far, far darker? The police meticulously noted every detail, from the last time the boys were seen playing to who had been in the vicinity of the house. That night, Wattle Creek was submerged in sorrow. The small community hall, usually a place for cheerful gatherings, became a center for quiet mourning as people dropped off casseroles and shared hushed condolences. But even as they tried to support one another, their hearts were filled with a gnawing unease. Under the dim glow of porch lights, troubled faces stared into the darkness towards the Jenkins home. No one knew that this terrible afternoon was only the beginning of a long and devastating story, a story of a fractured family, of hidden resentment, and a tragedy that would expose a wound so deep it would scar the entire town forever. As Sarah Jenkins slowly regained consciousness, the first sound she heard was her own ragged, broken sob. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her face was pale and streaked with dust, and her eyes were already swollen from tears that wouldn't stop. She crawled towards the small, still form of Finn, her hand reaching out to grasp his. She held it tightly, desperately searching for a warmth that was no longer there. His little hand was cold, lifeless. Her lips moved, trying to form a prayer, but the words shattered into incoherent sobs. Liam remained on the ground, cradling Leo's body, his cheek pressed against his son's hair. He kept whispering that he was sorry, that Dad should have been there to protect him. His raw grief was a palpable force, drawing tears from everyone who witnessed it. The neighbors who only ever saw Liam as a tough, hard-working shearer now saw a father who had lost his entire world. The yard of their modest weatherboard house filled with people, standing in a somber, helpless cluster. Mothers clutched their own children tightly, their faces etched with a shared, unimaginable fear. They whispered to each other that they couldn't fathom the pain of losing two children at once. An old farmer shook his head over and over, muttering that this kind of grief was too heavy a burden for any family to bear. As night fell, the Jenkins house remained a hub of sorrow. Young men from the footy club set up extra chairs in the yard, while women from the CWA started a kettle in the kitchen, making endless cups of tea and coffee for the mourners. Children were kept inside, held close by their parents. A blanket of fear had settled over Wattle Creek, thick and suffocating. Jack Murray sat on a wooden bench near the front door, his own eyes red-rimmed. He watched Liam and Sarah with profound sadness. In a voice raspy with emotion, he told a neighbor that this tragedy wasn't just for the Jenkins family, it was a wound for the whole town. He reminded everyone to stick together, to offer support, because a pain this immense couldn't be weathered alone. Mavis sat huddled in a corner of the living room, her face buried in her hands. She wailed and rocked back and forth, blaming herself for leaving the boys unattended for those few minutes. Neighbors tried to comfort her, rubbing her back and offering soothing words, but her grief seemed inconsolable. Her cries filled the small house with an air of utter despair. Amid the sorrow, a neighbor brought in the last clothes Leo and Finn had worn that morning, neatly folded, and placed them beside the bodies before they were taken away. Sarah stared at the simple t-shirts and shorts. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the soft cotton. She remembered that very morning, smoothing down the collar of Leo's shirt, and telling him to play nicely with his brother. The memory, once so sweet, was now a razor-sharp blade twisting in her heart. Several women in the room began to weep openly, saying that little boys were meant for laughter and muddy knees, not for this. The house was thick with the sounds of prayers, weeping, and hushed whispers, a symphony of grief that mingled with the chirping of crickets outside. Meanwhile, police officers kept a silent vigil by the irrigation channel. They had set up portable floodlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. They meticulously documented the scene, ensuring no one disturbed the area. Even these hardened officers were visibly shaken. One young constable bowed his head, admitting quietly to his partner that this was the most harrowing case he'd ever had to attend. Later that night, the boys' bodies were taken away for a formal examination. The sight of them being carried out in white bags caused a fresh eruption of grief. Sarah nearly collapsed again, but Liam held her upright, his own strength fueled by sheer will as he felt himself on the verge of crumbling. All of Wattle Creek seemed to be in mourning. No one slept properly that night. Lights stayed on in houses all over town as families sat together, speaking in low tones about the tragedy. They felt not just the loss of two of the town's children, but the loss of their own sense of security. If two small boys could die so suddenly in a shallow creek, how could anyone guarantee their own children were safe? The next morning, the sun rose pale and hesitant, and the air was cool despite the season. People began arriving at the Jenkins house again, bringing flowers and offering quiet condolences. Leo and Finn were brought home one last time, their small bodies laid out side by side, covered in clean white sheets. Their faces looked peaceful, as if they were in a deep, untroubled sleep. Sarah sat beside them, her eyes raw and swollen, her hand never ceasing its gentle stroking of the sheets that covered them. Jack Murray stood before the gathered mourners in the yard. In a heavy voice, he said that this tragedy was a brutal reminder of how fragile life is. He urged everyone to support one another, because only together could they begin to heal such a wound. But beneath the shared grief and prayers, a quiet current of unease had begun to flow. A few people started whispering about the strangeness of it all. They wondered how two boys could have died without making a sound. That question hung unspoken in the air, adding another layer of weight to the suffocating sorrow. This tragedy had not only broken the Jenkins family, it had trapped the entire town of Wattle Creek in a shadow of grief. And nobody yet realized that what had happened was just the gateway to a mystery far more sinister than any of them could imagine. The morning after the incident, the yellow police tape still fluttered like a grim warning along the banks of the Wattle Creek irrigation channel. Dew clung to the gum leaves, but the air felt heavy and stale. A few locals stood at a distance, their faces etched with anxiety. The usual sound of children's laughter was absent, replaced by a somber quiet. It was as if the shadow of death was still lingering over the town. More police arrived from the regional command in Wagga Wagga. They brought forensic kits, professional cameras, and notebooks, their movements precise and deliberate. The townspeople could only watch from afar. One woman whispered to her neighbor that she couldn't bear to look at the channel anymore. Every time she did, she saw the pale, lifeless faces of Leo and Finn. The investigators photographed the scene from every conceivable angle. Some knelt to examine the dry, cracked soil on the banks, while others took samples of the murky water. A senior detective sergeant, a man named Miller with a grim, world-weary face, stood observing it all, his expression unreadable. He directed his team with quiet gestures, ensuring every detail was scrutinized, that not a single stone was left unturned. The boys' bodies were examined again by a forensic pathologist. The team worked with a quiet reverence, gently inspecting the small forms. The townspeople looked away, unable to watch for long. Sarah, standing just inside the front door of her house, could only weep softly, held up by a few of the neighboring women. Liam stood stiffly behind her, his eyes red, but his face a mask of stoicism, trying to be strong for his wife. After some time, the preliminary findings were shared with the family. There were no signs of physical violence. The boy's skin was unmarked, without a single scratch or bruise. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Their clothes were intact. Their faces were serene, as if they had simply fallen asleep. This news only deepened the community's confusion. If they hadn't drowned in the traditional sense, what had killed them? The water in the channel was shallow enough for an 8-year-old to stand up in. And more unnervingly, no one had heard a single cry for help. Jack Murray stroked his white beard, shaking his head slowly. In a low, troubled voice, he said that something didn't add up. He remembered playing in that same channel as a boy. It was never deep enough to be considered truly dangerous. The people listening nodded in agreement, but they dared not speculate further. A young constable was tasked with taking statements from the neighbors. He asked who had last seen Leo and Finn that afternoon. Several people confirmed they had seen them playing in their front yard around 3 p.m. After that, no one had seen them again. Every piece of information was meticulously recorded, another small piece in a vast and disturbing puzzle. Back at the Jenkins house, the air was thick with grief. Prayers were still being murmured and mourners continued to arrive. But beneath the tears, the whispers of suspicion had started. Some speculated that a stranger might have come into town. Others, more quietly, felt a deep unease about the situation within the house itself. The hushed theories only added to the family's immense burden. Sarah sat listlessly beside the empty space where her children had lain, her gaze distant, as if a part of her soul had left with them. Liam stood behind her, sighing heavily from time to time. He heard the whispers of the townsfolk, but couldn't bring himself to say anything. His heart was a cavern of loss. The police investigation continued well into the afternoon. They took casts of footprints around the channel, examined the floating leaves, and even checked the wire fence that ran alongside the property. But the initial findings remained the same: no signs of a struggle, no evidence of violence. Everything was too calm, too quiet for such a horrific event. As dusk settled, casting a golden glow over the grim police tape, Detective Sergeant Miller closed his notebook. He said quietly to his partner that this mystery was just beginning. He had a gut feeling that something was being hidden, something that lay just beneath the surface of the town's collective grief. The people of Wattle Creek returned to their homes with heavy hearts. That night, children were held a little tighter, and no one dared let their little ones play outside alone. The town, once a picture of rural tranquility, was now steeped in fear and sorrow. And behind it all, the terrible question remained, if it wasn't an accident, what really happened to Leo and Finn? 2 days after the tragedy, Wattle Creek was still shrouded in a fog of grief. The scent of funeral wreaths hung in the air. People continued to visit the Jenkins home, offering casseroles and condolences. But behind the shared sorrow and quiet prayers, hushed conversations filled with doubt began to surface. The police, working from a makeshift office in the community hall, initially floated the theory that Leo and Finn might have simply drowned. At first, it seemed the most logical explanation. Kids play near water. Perhaps they slipped and fell in together, unable to save themselves. But when this theory was shared with the community, it only deepened the confusion. The water in the channel was notoriously shallow. Even a boy Leo's age should have been able to stand up and walk out. If one had fallen, the other would surely have screamed for help. It was the silence of that afternoon that haunted everyone. Jack Murray, sitting with a few other old-timers at the pub, shook his head. "I've lived here my whole life," he said, his voice low. "Played in that very channel as a lad. Never once heard of anyone drowning in it." The men around him nodded grimly. A woman who lived nearby added that she'd been hanging out her washing not far from the channel that afternoon and hadn't heard a single sound out of the ordinary. Her words amplified the strange, unsettling feeling that had taken hold of the town. When Liam Jenkins heard the drowning theory, he shook his head, his eyes red with a mixture of grief and frustration. Leo was a strong swimmer, he insisted. And even though Finn was smaller, he was always with his big brother. Liam was certain they couldn't have just drowned, not without a fight, not without a sound. His voice cracked as he said that something was terribly wrong with this story. Sarah remained in the house, a fragile ghost moving from room to room. She didn't say much, but would often stand staring at the family photos on the wall. In her heart, she felt a gnawing certainty that a dark secret shrouded her son's deaths, but she couldn't yet give it voice. Her tears had run dry, leaving only a hollow, aching void. The police didn't dismiss the community's doubts. They returned to the scene, meticulously re-examining it. They measured the water's depth again, noted the slow current, and wargamed various scenarios. One officer even waded into the channel to demonstrate just how shallow it was. The locals who watched became even more convinced that this was no accident. The whispers grew louder and more speculative. Some thought a stranger, a drifter, might have been passing through. Others, more daringly, began to suggest the answer might lie within the family itself. But no one dared voice such a heavy accusation aloud, not while the family was so deep in mourning. That evening, Jack Murray stood before a small crowd that had gathered outside the hall after dropping off food. "We can't be jumping to conclusions and pointing fingers," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He reminded them that the police were doing their job, and that the town's job was to support each other. Yet even he couldn't shake the deep sense of unease that had settled in his own gut. That night, Liam sat alone on the front veranda for a long time. The cool night air carried the sound of crickets and the smell of damp earth. He stared into the darkness towards the channel, remembering the sound of his boys' laughter as they played there. He made a silent promise to them that he would find out what really happened, even if it meant tearing open a wound that might never heal. In neighboring houses, the whispers continued. Several mothers noted that the boys' faces had looked too peaceful, as if they were asleep, not like victims of a frantic drowning. An old farmer added that drowning victims usually showed signs of panic, scratches, mud in their mouths. But Leo and Finn had been found clean, without a single mark of struggle. The more people talked, the greater the doubt grew. The drowning theory, once the most plausible explanation, now seemed the least likely. The police couldn't ignore it either. They noted every inconsistency, every strange detail, and began to realize this case was far from simple. That night, The lights stayed on late at the Jenkins house as mourners continued to sit with the family, offering their silent support. But on everyone's faces, a profound loss was now mixed with the shadow of an unanswered question. And in their hearts, a dreadful awareness began to dawn: this was no mere tragedy. It was the beginning of a dark secret, a secret that would test the bonds of family, community, and justice in Wattle Creek. With the initial examination of the scene complete, the police began the delicate process of formally interviewing the family members. They needed to establish a clear timeline of Leo and Finn's last hours. The entire town held its breath, waiting for answers, anxious to understand what had happened behind the closed doors of the Jenkins home. That afternoon, Liam and Sarah sat in their own living room, a space that now felt vast and empty. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion, their eyes swollen from endless crying. A detective sat opposite them, his notebook open, his questions gentle but precise. Sarah spoke in a faint, trembling voice. She recounted that on the day of the tragedy, she had last seen her boys playing in the yard. Before she left for her shift at the packing shed, she had entrusted them to the care of Mavis, Liam's mother. Liam added that just before he'd left for the shearing shed, he'd ruffled both boys' hair, telling them to listen to their nan and not to wander off. He never imagined it would be the last thing he ever said to them. His voice grew hoarse, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. When asked if any strangers had visited the house that day, both he and Sarah shook their heads. There had been no visitors, nothing out of the ordinary, just another routine day. Sarah began to cry again, saying she could still hear her boys' laughter as she walked down the driveway. That happy sound now echoed in her memory as a torturous refrain. After speaking with the parents, it was Mavis's turn. The elderly woman entered the room with a frail, trembling gait. Her white hair was pinned back neatly, but her eyes were red and puffy. She sat down, her hands wringing a small handkerchief. Her voice was raspy as she began her account. She explained that around 3 o'clock, she was watching Leo and Finn play in the yard. Then, she said, she went out to the vegetable patch at the back of the house to pick some greens for dinner. She insisted she was only gone for a short while, maybe 20 minutes at most. When she returned, her grandsons were nowhere to be seen. She assumed they had run off to a friend's house, so she went back to her cooking. It was only when she heard the screams from the direction of the channel that she rushed outside and discovered the horrific truth. Mavis's story seemed plausible, and she wept uncontrollably as she told it. The townspeople, who heard her account, felt a renewed wave of sympathy. They all knew her as a doting grandmother who often walked her grandsons to the local hall for kids' activities. Seeing her so devastated, her voice choked with grief, made many of them weep alongside her. But the detective didn't stop there. He asked small, detailed questions. What vegetables had she picked? How long, exactly, was she in the garden? Did anyone see her there? Mavis answered as best she could, her replies often interrupted by sobs. Though her answers seemed reasonable, the detective noted everything with a quiet intensity. Liam, listening to his mother's testimony, lowered his head. His heart was torn between his filial duty and a faint, unwelcome flicker of suspicion. He couldn't imagine his own mother being involved in anything so terrible. Yet the circumstances were forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable questions. Sarah simply stared at the floor, not daring to look at her mother-in-law. Their relationship had always been strained, but in the face of such a monumental loss, she didn't want to create more pain with accusations. She just wanted answers, an end to the nightmare. After the interviews, the detectives stepped outside to confer in the yard. The waiting neighbors began to whisper among themselves. Some said Mavis's story made perfect sense, a tragic, momentary lapse in supervision. Others murmured quietly that perhaps there were details still hidden beneath the tears. That night, prayers once again filled the Jenkins home. But behind the solemn recitations, a question lingered in everyone's mind: how could two children vanish so quickly? Did they really just wander off and fall into the channel, or was there something more, something unseen, hidden behind the family's grief-stricken faces? Jack Murray stood outside the house, looking towards the yellow tape still marking the channel. He said quietly to another town elder that this mystery was only getting deeper. He felt the truth was still hiding, veiled by a curtain of sorrow. 2 days after the funeral, Wattle Creek was still in a state of shock. The flowers on Leo and Finn's small graves had not yet wilted, and a steady stream of townspeople came to pay their respects. Sarah and Liam were there every morning, sitting silently by the freshly turned earth, their tears watering the ground. They prayed for their sons' souls to find peace, a peace that they themselves felt they would never know again. Then, on the third day, a shocking piece of news arrived from the forensic lab in Wagga Wagga. The official autopsy results were complete. A detective drove back to Wattle Creek with a sealed brown envelope that held the town's breath. The local officers gathered in their small station, their faces tense. They knew the contents of that envelope would change the course of the investigation entirely. When the seal was broken, the room fell silent. The lead pathologist's report was read aloud in a low, steady voice. Leo and Finn had not died from drowning. There was no water in their lungs, no signs of asphyxiation. Instead, high concentrations of a potent poison had been found in their systems, a common rodenticide. The atmosphere in the room instantly grew heavy. A young constable let out a long, shaky breath, while his colleagues stared grimly at the report. They all knew, in that moment, that this was no longer a tragic accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of evil. The news spread through the town like a destructive bushfire. People were stunned into disbelief. A woman dropping off her kids at school dropped her handbag on the pavement. A farmer listening to the news on his ute radio pulled over and buried his face in his hands. No one could comprehend that 2 innocent children had been poisoned. At home, Liam and Sarah were visited by Detective Sergeant Miller. When he delivered the news, Liam's face went white, his hands began to shake. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide with a new kind of horror. Sarah crumpled to the floor, a strangled cry escaping her lips. She screamed, refusing to accept that her sons' deaths were not an accident, but a murder. Her cries of anguish echoed through the quiet street, breaking the hearts of all who heard them. That evening, Jack Murray came to their house. In a grave voice, he told them this was the town's darkest hour. He insisted that the truth, no matter how painful, had to be found, because justice for those 2 little boys could not be denied. His words seemed to steel the resolve of the mourners gathered in the yard. The police immediately shifted the entire focus of their investigation. The drowning theory was discarded. Now, they were hunting for a poisoner. The rodenticide couldn't have been ingested by accident. Someone had to have deliberately administered it, likely mixed into a drink or food. The most chilling question of all arose: who could have gotten close enough to the boys to give them poison without raising their suspicion? Leo and Finn were good kids, but they'd been taught not to take things from strangers. The suspicion, heavy and unavoidable, began to circle back to those closest to them, the people they trusted implicitly. The whispers among the townsfolk grew louder, more fearful. Some still clung to the idea of an outsider, a malevolent stranger. But others began to voice the terrifying possibility that the killer was someone the boys knew and loved. No one dared to say a name, but the unspoken accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah sat in her living room, clutching a photo of her sons, her voice a barely audible whisper, as she repeated, "Who could do this? Who could be so cruel?" Liam wrapped his arms around her, his own heart shattered by the weight of his grief and his failure to protect his family. That night, the community hall was filled again for a prayer service. But this time, they weren't just praying for the souls of Leo and Finn. They were praying for the truth to be revealed, for justice to find its way through the darkness. The detectives worked late into the night. A map of Wattle Creek spread across a table. They started making a list of everyone who had regular contact with the boys. The lead investigator, Miller, remarked grimly that the killer was not only cruel but cunning, using the channel to stage a drowning and cover their tracks. The forensic report had ripped away the veil of tragedy, revealing the ugly face of murder beneath. Wattle Creek, once a town united in grief, was now a town haunted by suspicion. A human hand had taken the lives of 2 innocent children. The question that now tormented every soul was no longer what happened, but who was responsible. And why? The revelation from the forensic report turned the investigation on its head. The police, no longer searching for the cause of an accident, were now hunting a murderer. Poison was not a random act of fate, it required a deliberate hand, a hand that Leo and Finn would have trusted. The lead detective, Sergeant Miller, reconvened his team at the Wattle Creek police station. They pinned a large town map to the wall and began listing every person connected to the Jenkins family. A red circle was drawn around the names of those closest to the boys. One detective voiced the grim theory that the perpetrator was almost certainly someone from inside the house. This news sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the town. The hushed whispers that had followed the tragedy now grew into fearful, urgent conversations. People asked each other who could possibly be capable of such a monstrous act, but no one dared to utter a name. Accusing a family member of murdering their own kin felt like a sin in itself. Liam was called back to the station. This time, the atmosphere was different, more tense. He was asked detailed questions about his son's daily routines, about who usually prepared their meals and drinks. Liam answered in a hoarse voice that, besides himself and his wife, the boys spent the most time with their grandmother, Mavis. But he was quick to add, "My mum loved those boys. She wouldn't hurt a hair on their heads." He refused to believe the woman who raised him could be capable of such evil. Sarah was also questioned again. Her eyes were sunken and hollow. She confirmed that nothing seemed unusual on the day of their deaths. She remembered giving the boys their breakfast before she left for work. After that, she said, her mother-in-law was in charge. Her words were quiet, heavy with unspeakable sorrow. She was trapped between a growing, terrifying doubt and her respect for her husband's mother. The detectives listened patiently, their faces impassive. They didn't make any direct accusations, but their notes were all pointing towards one inescapable conclusion. Only a family member could have administered poison to the children without arousing suspicion. In the town's only pub, locals gathered, their conversations muted. One old farmer said he couldn't bring himself to believe the whispers about Mavis. He recalled seeing her countless times, her face alight with a gentle smile as she played with her grandsons. A woman added that Mavis was always the first to bake for the CWA, a pillar of the community. Yet, others began to question if that loving exterior was all there was. Was it genuine affection, or was it a mask? Jack Murray, polishing glasses behind the bar, listened to it all. He finally spoke, his voice firm. "We can't be tearing each other apart with gossip and suspicion," he warned. "The truth will come out. Our job is to keep this town from falling apart." His words shamed some into silence, but the unease remained. That night, Liam sat alone on his veranda again. The detective's words echoed in his mind, poison had to be given. His heart was in turmoil. He wanted to believe in his mother's innocence, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she was the only one with the boys that afternoon. Sarah came out and sat beside him. For a long time, they didn't speak, just listened to the sound of the wind in the gum trees. Finally, Sarah whispered that she didn't know who to trust anymore. She loved her husband and respected his mother, but the loss of her children had filled her with 1,000 painful questions. Liam took her hand, his grip tight. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. At the police station, investigators continued their work. They started visiting local hardware stores and farm suppliers, asking if anyone had recently purchased the brand of rodenticide found in the boys' bodies. The trail was still cold, but they were confident that the killer had left a trace somewhere. Wattle Creek grew more fearful. Doors were locked earlier. Children were kept close. The thought that the killer could be one of their own, someone they saw every day, was a horror far greater than the idea of a faceless stranger. That night, the church hall was full again. This time, the prayers were not just for the souls of Leo and Finn, but for courage, the courage to face the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be. Liam stared up at the star-filled sky, tears streaming down his face. He whispered into the darkness that he was ready to hear the truth, no matter how bitter, to find out who had stolen his sons from him. The shadow of suspicion was no longer an external threat, it had fallen over his own home, suffocating a family already broken by grief. The investigation had now entered its darkest phase. 4 days after the funeral, Liam Jenkins was back at the police station. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep, hollow sorrow. He sat on a cold plastic chair opposite Detective Sergeant Miller, whose questions now cut deeper, probing not just the day of the tragedy, but the daily life within the Jenkins home. With a quiet, heavy voice, Liam began to speak. He admitted that his household was not always a peaceful one. The relationship between his wife, Sarah, and his mother, Mavis, was fraught with a long-simmering tension. He lowered his head, the admission weighing heavily on him, but he knew the truth could no longer be hidden. According to Liam, Mavis frequently complained that Sarah wasn't a good enough wife or mother. She would say Sarah was wasteful with money, didn't keep the house clean enough, and lacked respect for her elders. Every evening when Liam returned from work, his mother would greet him with a fresh litany of grievances, her tone sharp with disapproval. On the other side of this silent war, Sarah felt utterly worn down. She worked a grueling shift at the packing shed from dawn till dusk to help make ends meet, yet she felt her efforts were never acknowledged. To her, Mavis's words were a constant barrage of criticism, not support. Her heart ached with the injustice of it all, and she often cried in secret, hiding her tears from Liam to avoid causing more conflict. Liam confessed he was often trapped in the middle. He loved his wife, but he was also bound by duty and respect for his mother. He tried to mediate, to smooth things over, but his efforts were usually futile. The arguments would sometimes escalate, their raised voices carrying out into the quiet street. Neighbors would pretend not to hear, but everyone in Wattle Creek knew the Jenkins home was not a happy one. Detective Miller noted everything meticulously. He and his partner exchanged a knowing glance. They were beginning to see a possible motive. But they didn't push, not yet. They knew that tensions between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law were common, but in this case, that tension might have been the spark that ignited a firestorm. Back at the house, Sarah wept as she recounted the same painful story to another officer. She described feeling suffocated, constantly watched and judged. "I never felt like I could do anything right," she choked out between sobs. "I felt so alone, even when the house was full." A few neighbors were also called in to give statements. One woman confirmed she often heard arguments coming from the Jenkins place. She said it was nothing new, everyone knew Sarah, and Mavis didn't get along. But in a small town, people tended to mind their own business. Jack Murray sighed heavily when asked. He admitted he had once tried to intervene, visiting the house to gently suggest they find a way to respect each other. But his advice had fallen on deaf ears. The tension remained, a well-known but unspoken fact of life in Wattle Creek. These testimonies painted a clear picture for the investigators. The conflict in the Jenkins household was more than just minor friction, it was a deep, festering wound. It was possible that someone had been nursing a grudge for so long that their heart had turned to stone. When emotions reached a breaking point, poison could have become a twisted weapon of revenge. For Liam, this realization was devastating. In the interview room, he finally broke down, sobbing that he never imagined their family problems could lead to the deaths of his innocent children. He remembered an old saying that even a tiger won't eat its own cubs. He wouldn't believe his own mother could be so cruel. But the facts laid out before him were impossible to ignore. He returned home that night with heavy, dragging steps. He and Sarah sat on the veranda in a shared, desolate silence, the only sound the rustling of the gum leaves in the night breeze. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She said she had often felt like leaving, but had always stayed for the boys. Now they were gone, and the pain in her heart was a bottomless pit. Liam took her hand. "Whatever comes next," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "we have to be ready for it. The truth, no matter how ugly, is better than living with these lies." The secret, it seemed, was not from the outside world. It was nestled deep within their own fractured family, hidden behind the broken relationship between a mother and her daughter-in-law. After uncovering the deep-seated conflict within the Jenkins family, the police knew they needed more than just testimony. Words could be shaped by emotion and grief, but hard evidence was irrefutable. They decided to conduct a thorough sweep of Wattle Creek, searching for any and all CCTV footage from the day of the tragedy. It was a daunting task. Wattle Creek was a simple, old-fashioned town. Most houses were weatherboard cottages with fly-screen doors, not modern homes with security systems. But the police were determined. They believed that an electronic eye, somewhere, might have recorded the truth, unswayed by tears or pity. Officers began a slow, methodical canvass, going door to door. They politely explained their purpose, asking residents and business owners if they had any cameras, and if so, for permission to review the footage. Some people were immediately cooperative, eager to help. Others were hesitant, worried about the hassle. The police had to be patient, reassuring them, explaining how a single, fleeting image could solve the entire case. Jack Murray accompanied them on their rounds. His respected presence helped to smooth things over. "This is for Leo and Finn," he would say in his quiet, gentle voice, and even the most reluctant residents would nod and agree to help. Slowly, the footage began to come in. There was a camera pointed at a chicken coop, another covering the dusty forecourt of the local mechanic's workshop. The grain silo on the edge of town had a camera, but its view was partially obscured by a large gum tree. The officers spent hours upon hours back at the station, poring over every second of the recordings. Their eyes grew tired and strained, but their resolve never wavered. A young constable, poring over his fifth hour of footage, said to his sergeant, "We can't miss a thing." He rewound and replayed clips, his focus absolute. The nights were long, filled with the hum of computer fans and the repetitive click of a mouse. Liam would occasionally stop by the station, his heart pounding every time a new clip was played on the screen. He was desperate for answers, but terrified of what he might see. Sarah sometimes sat with him, her hand gripping his, both of them knowing that this footage could change their lives forever. Days passed. Dozens of hours of footage were reviewed. Most of it was mundane, kids playing cricket in the street, farmers driving their utes, women carrying groceries. It all seemed so painfully normal, as if the tragedy had never happened. But the investigators persisted. They believed a camera never sleeps, and that the smallest detail could be the key. Jack Murray would often bring them coffee and sandwiches, sitting with them in silent solidarity. "The truth is a stubborn thing," he'd say. "But it can't hide forever. Then, finally, after days of painstaking work, a detective stopped a video. "Hang on," he said, leaning closer to the screen. "Zoom in on that." The footage was from a security camera on the local petrol station, its wide-angle lens capturing a stretch of the road leading out of town towards the irrigation channel. The image was grainy, but it was clear enough. An elderly woman was walking along the side of the road, holding the hands of two small boys. The timestamp on the screen read 3:05 p.m., on the day of the tragedy. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the screen. The woman's gait, the headscarf she wore, her very posture, it was unmistakably Mavis Jenkins. The next few seconds of footage showed her walking with Leo and Finn, heading in the direction of the channel, until they disappeared behind a thicket of trees. The team waited, their breath held. 20 minutes later, the figure of Mavis Jenkins emerged from behind the trees and walked back into frame. This time, she was alone. Her face was calm, her pace unhurried. There was no sign of panic, no distress. It was as if she was simply returning from a casual stroll. The officers looked at each other, their expressions grim. Liam, who was in the room at that moment, froze. A strangled sound escaped his throat. Sarah, who had just walked in, saw the screen and covered her mouth with both hands, a silent scream in her eyes. Jack Murray, standing behind them, went pale. He let out a long, shuddering breath and whispered, "That's it. That's the answer we were looking for." That night, the weight of the truth began to settle over Wattle Creek, and it was a truth far more bitter and horrifying than anyone had ever imagined. Days after the discovery of the CCTV footage, the police summoned Mavis Jenkins back to the station. She arrived looking frail and tired, dressed in a drab cardigan, her eyes red and puffy as if from sleepless nights. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at her eyes periodically. In the stark, windowless interview room, the silence was broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. The detectives let her sit for a moment before they began. They didn't ask any questions at first, just watched her, letting the silence build. In a raspy, tearful voice, Mavis began to speak without being prompted. She insisted she was innocent, that she loved her grandsons more than life itself. Her words were a torrent of grief and denial, her hand rising to her chest as if to plead her case to the heavens. A few minutes later, one of the detectives quietly opened a laptop on the table. The screen lit up, displaying the grainy image that had already sent shockwaves through the town. Without a word, he pressed play. The video showed Mavis, clear as day, walking hand in hand with Leo and Finn towards the channel. Then, after the agonizing 20-minute gap, it showed her walking back, her posture calm, her face placid. Alone. The room was utterly still. Mavis stared at the screen, her eyes widening in shock. The hand holding the tissue began to tremble violently. Her face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing silently, no words coming out. Her tears began to fall again, but this time they were not tears of grief. They were the tears of a cornered animal. Detective Sergeant Miller spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That footage doesn't lie, Mavis. The truth is better out in the open." Mavis tried to speak, her voice a weak croak. She stammered that she had just been taking the boys for a walk, nothing more. But when the detective replayed the clip, pointing out the chilling discrepancy between her journey there with 2 children and her solitary return, her words faltered and died in her throat. Liam had been permitted to be in the room. He sat in a corner, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He couldn't bring himself to look at his mother. His heart was being torn in two, the love for the woman who raised him warring with the rage of a father whose children had been stolen. Sarah was also there, watching from another corner, her face a mask of wet, shattered grief. She covered her mouth to stifle a cry. This was the moment she had both dreaded and yearned for, the confirmation of a horror she had never wanted to believe. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Mavis let the tissue fall from her trembling hand onto the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was a barely audible whisper. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Then, haltingly, she confessed. She spoke of a deep, corrosive hatred for her daughter-in-law, a resentment that had festered for years. Day by day, she said, that bitterness grew, until it had poisoned her heart, and overshadowed even her love for her own grandsons. The room seemed to grow colder. The only sound was the muffled sobs coming from Liam and Sarah. Mavis continued, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She described how, on that afternoon, she had mixed the rodenticide into 2 glasses of cordial and given it to Leo and Finn. After they grew weak and collapsed, she carried their small, limp bodies to the irrigation channel to make it look like they had drowned. She thought everyone would believe it was a tragic accident. Her words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to the hearts of those listening. Even the seasoned detectives seemed shaken. They were trained to be objective, but they were still human, and the coldness of the confession was staggering. Liam finally broke, burying his face in his hands. A raw, agonized sob tore from his throat. "How could you, Mum?" he choked out. "How could you?" Sarah rushed to his side, holding him, though she herself was collapsing under the weight of the confession. The admission was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. There was no more room for doubt, no other explanation. The truth, in all its bitter ugliness, was now laid bare on the cold table of the interview room. That night, news of Mavis's confession spread through Wattle Creek. The town reacted with a mixture of shock, fury, and profound sadness. The woman they had pitied, the grandmother they had comforted, was a murderer. Wattle Creek would never be the same again. The next morning, the police announced they would be conducting a crime scene reconstruction at the irrigation channel. The purpose was to have Mavis walk them through her confessed actions, to corroborate her statement for the coming trial. The news flew through Wattle Creek, and by the time the sun was fully up, a large, somber crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and raw anger. The yellow tape was back up, and officers formed a perimeter to keep the onlookers at a distance. Many still found it impossible to believe that a grandmother could do something so monstrous to her own flesh and blood. Mavis was brought to the scene in a police car. She looked even smaller and more haggard than before, her face ashen. She kept her head down, avoiding the burning, accusatory stares of the people she had known her entire life. A detective calmly instructed her to show them what she did. Using props, her hands shaking, Mavis took 2 plastic cups. She mimed pouring a drink and then sprinkling in the poison. The crowd watched in horrified silence. A few people began to cry softly, unable to bear the sight. Next, she pretended to offer the drinks to 2 small dolls that had been placed on the grass to represent Leo and Finn. Her voice was a barely audible murmur, as she reenacted the gentle, coaxing words she had used to lure her grandsons to their deaths. The cruel irony of her soft tone sent a shudder through the crowd. Then, slowly, she picked up the dolls, one by one, and carried them towards the channel. She walked down the slippery bank and placed them in the murky water. At that moment, the crowd's restraint broke. Several people shouted in anger and disgust. A woman collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Liam and Sarah stood far back from the crowd, leaning against their ute for support. They couldn't bear to get any closer. To see the monstrous act replayed, even with dolls, was like having the knife twisted in a wound that would never heal. Jack Murray stood at the front of the crowd, his face a mask of sorrow. He bowed his head, tears tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. He whispered to himself that this was proof of how deep and dark the poison of resentment could run. The atmosphere grew more volatile. A few young men lunged towards the police line, shouting curses at Mavis. The officers had to work hard to maintain control, urging people to remain calm. After every step of the crime had been demonstrated, a heavy silence fell again. Mavis was led to a plastic chair, where she sat staring at the ground, her face a blank canvas of exhaustion and despair. The reconstruction was complete. As the police car took Mavis away, the crowd parted slowly, their eyes following her with a mixture of hatred and pity. A little girl asked her mother, "Why did that Nan do a bad thing?" The mother just hugged her daughter tightly, unable to find an answer. That night, Wattle Creek was once again united in grief, but this time it was a grief mixed with a terrible understanding. The reconstruction had stripped away any lingering doubt. Everyone now knew exactly how two innocent boys had lost their lives. The quiet little town was forever changed, haunted by a tragedy born from a bitterness that had festered within a single family home. The day of the trial arrived under a sky the color of slate. A cold, drizzling rain fell, turning the dirt roads leading to the Indramayo Regional Courthouse into mud. The people of Wattle Creek came in droves, packed into utes and cars, determined to see justice done. The courtroom was filled to capacity, a sea of grim, tense faces all focused on the defendant's box. There sat Mavis Jenkins, looking impossibly small and frail in the cavernous room. She kept her head bowed, refusing to meet the gaze of anyone. Across the aisle, Liam and Sarah sat side by side, their faces worn with exhaustion and sorrow. Today, they were not just grieving parents, they were witnesses, demanding justice for their sons. A sharp rap of the gavel silenced the room as the judge entered. The Crown prosecutor rose and began to read the indictment. In a clear, unwavering voice, he laid out the facts of the case: how Mavis had premeditated the murders, deliberately purchasing rodenticide and mixing it into a sweet drink to conceal its taste. He described how she had then callously disposed of her grandsons' bodies in the irrigation channel, in a calculated attempt to cover her crime. Each detail was laid out with clinical precision, and with every word, the collective breath of the courtroom seemed to catch. Liam hung his head, silent tears falling onto his clasped hands. Sarah squeezed his arm, her own body trembling, each word of the indictment a fresh stab to her wounded heart. Mavis's defense lawyer argued for leniency, citing his client's old age, her fragile health, and her eventual confession. But his words sounded hollow and weak against the sheer gravity of her crime. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gallery. When given the chance to speak, Mavis stood unsteadily. Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper, almost lost in the sound of the rain outside. She said she was sorry, that her heart had been consumed by anger and resentment towards her daughter-in-law. She confessed that her long-held grudge had blinded her, leading her to harm the very children she was meant to love and protect. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, but they elicited no sympathy. The wound she had inflicted was too deep, too unforgivable. After a brief recess, the judge returned. In a voice that boomed with authority, he declared that the court found the defendant's actions to be a calculated and heinous act of murder, marked by a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. She had not only taken the lives of her own grandchildren, but had tried to deceive her family and her entire community. The final verdict was delivered, guilty on 2 counts of premeditated murder. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. A wave of sound washed over the courtroom, a mixture of tearful relief and choked sobs. Liam slumped in his seat, his body shaking with the release of months of tension. Sarah held him, her own tears flowing freely. They had justice, but they knew it would never bring their boys back. Mavis collapsed into her chair, her eyes vacant, her face a mask of dull resignation. As court officers led her away, the townspeople watched her go, their expressions a complex tapestry of anger, sadness, and a sliver of pity for the broken old woman she had become. The people of Wattle Creek drove home through the rain in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the profound darkness that had touched their small town. That evening, a service was held at the community hall. This time, the prayers were not just for Leo and Finn, but for the entire community, a plea for healing and a prayer that such bitterness would never again take root in their families. Jack Murray stood before his neighbors, his voice heavy with emotion. He said this tragedy must serve as a reminder to everyone that small conflicts, if left to fester, can grow into a fire that consumes everything it touches. Back in her quiet, empty house, Sarah looked at the photos of her sons on the wall. The tears still came, but for the first time in months, she felt a sliver of peace. Justice had been served. Liam sat beside her, taking her hand. They both knew the scar on their hearts would never fade, but they had to find a way to keep living. The tragedy of Leo and Finn Jenkins left an indelible mark on Wattle Creek. It became a cautionary tale, a lesson in how love can be twisted by resentment, and how the innocent can become casualties in the wars of adults. That night, as the last prayers faded, the people of Wattle Creek went home with a new resolve in their heavy hearts,